Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a list of some winter book recommendations. Almost all of these are fantasy, but I do have a couple of other genres mixed in, just so that way if you want to branch out a little bit, if you're like me and you mostly read fantasy, you have those options, and if you're somebody who doesn't really want to read fantasy, then there's something for you as well. Jumping into it, the first two are ones that basically everybody puts on their winter book recommendations, especially if they're specifically recommending fantasy books for the winter, and I just figured we'd go ahead and get those out of the way now because I do agree with these two books, and that would be The Bear and the Nightingale and Spinning Silver. These are essentially quintessential fantasy winter reads. Spinning Silver is a historical fantasy that follows a young woman whose family is starting to find themselves in the grips of poverty, and this is a result of her father being a moneylender who is very bad at getting the money that is owed to him from the people he's loaned money to. And so the main character, Miriam, is done with her father not being willing to take what is theirs, and so she decides she's going to take that upon herself due to the time period and the fact that it is historical and it's relating to real things in history. You do find that a big part of her father's hesitation has to do with the fact that they are Jewish, and he knows that there are some negative stereotypes that people will draw from the moment they want to give themselves an excuse to not pay him. So there is legitimate fear, there is a legitimate reason why her father is so hesitant, but she is tired of seeing her family go hungry. She's tired of seeing them get sick, and so she decides she's going to put an end to it. But in gaining interest back on what is owed to them, it catches the attention of the Fae, who think of this as her transforming silver into gold, hence the name Spinning Silver. So once she's captured the attention of the Fae, that's when the story really takes a turn. The Fae in this are terrifying, mysterious, interesting, fascinating. They're not necessarily the Fae that we've come to see so often in fantasy as more romance-centered, so they play a role in the atmosphere itself. You also have a variety of other characters that are within this story, and there are actually really, really gripping moments. There's really emotional moments, but everything is kind of quiet and contained, and I absolutely loved it. I think it's very fitting of the season, not just because of the historical setting, but also the fact that the cold plays such a role in their day-to-day lives, and the Fae being so a part of the atmosphere, I think inherently makes the book feel atmospheric also. Then The Bear and the Nightingale, I don't think I am alone or original in saying that this book makes you feel cold. It makes you so aware of how brutal cold weather can be, and that sounds maybe a little obvious and silly, but especially in this setting, which is also, like Spinning Silver, a historical fantasy, they are thinking about the winter months in advance. They're thinking about it based off of the food that they're bringing in. They're thinking about it when it comes to how they're able to trade, their economy. They're thinking constantly ahead for the winter. And this is sort of a northeastern-inspired European fantasy, so it is bitter cold. It is cold that will kill you if you are out in it for too long. On top of that, there is also a fantastical element to the story that has to do with the atmosphere, that has to do with folklore, and it's actually quite dark. I was surprised when I picked this up that I thought it was going to be cozier, but it almost could fit in the fall spooky season as well, because some of the folklore is pretty terrifying. For those of you that are fans of Witcher, I think you're going to see some folklore inspiration here that might be similar to what you find in Witcher as well. Ultimately, if you're looking for kind of a creepy by the fire fantasy story where you aren't bundling up because you're cozy with your hot cocoa, but you're bundling up because you're cold and it's dark and maybe a little scary, this is the perfect book for that. The next two stories are historical fiction. They are quite different from one another, but I think both are very fitting for the winter season. One of them would be Burial Rites. This is a very, very sad story. It's a fictional version of a real person and real events in history. So the setup is we are looking at the last woman who was executed in Iceland. She was a real person. I've been to Iceland. I've driven through the area where she was buried. I didn't get to go to her grave because we were already kind of past that point. But regardless, it hits very heavy. And so most of the story is trying to paint the picture, trying to put yourself in this woman's shoes, and the time period in which the book takes place and that these events took place. there was definitely a certain role expected of women, and if you didn't fit within that role, then people had some ideas of your guilt, because she is essentially found guilty for the murder of a man, and you don't know for a lot of the book whether she did or did not commit this murder. So you're sort of discovering the truth as you read the story, and you're discovering the way that the truth has been distorted as a result of these views that they have on her in particular. And in this time, the idea of burial rites, before you die, they want to give you the opportunity to be right with God. And so she ends up living with this nice little family who don't want this woman in their house. They think she's a murderer. And they're a nice family who's been chosen specifically because of the fact that they fit the formula of what a nice family is supposed to be. And so they figure, okay, well, they'll put her right before she dies. And so the whole book, you're like, are they going to kill her? Is she guilty? This is sad. But it's also extremely good. It's one of those books that you read that just, I came away from it filled with so much more empathy for the world and for people in history and people now. And it's just one of those stories that puts things into perspective. While still being historical fiction, this next one is very different from that, and that would be Vinland Saga. I have praised Vinland Saga for years. I have been trying to get people to read Vinland Saga for years. It's almost always in the background of my shelves, and it is so good. It's not fantasy, and I usually talk about fantasy, but Vinland Saga is absolutely amazing. We follow this young boy named Thorfinn, and his father was a Viking, and he left that life behind to pursue a peaceful life in Iceland, another Icelandic story. It doesn't entirely take place in Iceland, though. He not only didn't want that life for himself, but he didn't want to have that life for his family. And so Thorfinn is kind of just a young kid just enjoying life with his family until his father's past comes knocking. And then from there, it becomes a story of revenge. It's not just that, though. I think a lot of revenge stories can fall into some similar tropes that you expect. You expect the whole, oh, is this quest for revenge really worth it? And are you losing yourself in this pursuit of revenge? You do see those, but there's so much more to it. It's sort of the meaning of life, the meaning of what it is to actually be a hero, the meaning of being content, and being content in a world that is unfair. There's so many extremely hard-hitting moments in this series. When you first start it, it might seem like kind of a typical action-packed manga, or there is an anime adaptation. It might seem like, oh, it's just, another action-packed story. It hits incredibly hard. It has so much depth. Absolutely cannot recommend Vinland Saga enough. It's very, very, very good. The next two are both Norse inspired. We have Shadow of the Gods. This is the first book in the Bloodsworn saga. And then we also have Witch's Heart. I have the sleeve off right here, but I'll have the image on the screen for you. So Shadow of the Gods, or the Bloodsworn, it is a fantasy world. It does not take place in our own world, but there are a lot of nods to Norse mythology. And I think if you're somebody who really is captivated and fascinated by Norse mythology, you will really like the way that John Gwynne has woven that into the lore of their world, and some of which maybe isn't quite lore. And you kind of discover what is and isn't real, and what was real, how has that been changed over years and years and years of people's stories being told. We follow a few different characters in the first book, and then the cast of characters expands, or I should say the perspectives expand. You have three main perspectives in this first story, all of whom, despite the world being very epic, have very personal stories. We have one woman who clearly has a mysterious, interesting past, but kind of similar to Vinland Saga, she's left that life behind, and she has her husband and her son, but her past seems to want to catch up with her. And then you see her embracing the skills of her past in pursuit of something that she cares very much about. Then you have another character who is trying to find the person that had something to do with what happened to his sister. And then you have another character who at first just seems like she's trying to become the best of the best when it comes to warriors. And then when you find out more about her situation, I think things become a lot more interesting. There's some interesting family dynamics. So it has these very personal stories within this epic world. And I would say that in the sequel, you go from having these three you feel like they're good guys, and then in the sequel, it opens up and you get the antagonists, but one antagonist in particular is sort of a morally gray character that then makes you look at the other characters a little differently. One of them is just, ugh, you can't stand this character, but being in their head in the sequel is really interesting. So I highly recommend that if you have been wanting to try this series, the winter is the perfect time to give it a go. Witch's Heart follows Angrboda, who is Loki's witch wife. She is the mother of monsters. And this is a heartbreaking story about motherhood, about independence. And there's so much to it that feels somewhat slice of life for a while. And you see this character who is not necessarily among the gods. She has certain powers that she doesn't really want to share with Odin. She doesn't really want to share it with the other gods. And she's mostly living the life of a human. And Loki comes in and out of her life. She's fine with that. She's fine with the interactions that they have. She likes a lot of the time to herself. But no matter how hard she tries to live this life where she can just basically be happy and content, her powers make it essentially impossible for other powerful beings to not take note of her and want to take advantage of what she's capable of. It's definitely not an action-packed story. If you hear, oh, Norse gods, so this is going to be really cool. I wouldn't say that this is a cool story. It is slower going, it is slower moving, it's a lot more introspective, but I think it's quite beautiful and tragic at the same time. There's a bittersweetness to the story. I quite liked it. I like the writing style. I think it's beautifully told, and I just think it fits so well with that. It's cold outside, you're kind of not in any hurry, and you're just letting yourself be captivated by the story. I think that this story is very fitting for that. Next up, we have both Blood Heir and the Shadow and Bone trilogy. So the reason I'm kind of recommending these side by side is because I pretty frequently describe Blood Heir as feeling like the next thing you would read after Six of Crows. So the Grishaverse, we have the Shadow and Bone trilogy, and then you have the Six of Crows duology. And everybody notes that Six of Crows feels like a slightly older version, meaning that it ages up with its audience. And then to me, Blood Heir is the next step. It's not quite adult fantasy. It's still young adult, but it feels very much on the older end. And the story, the setup, I just want to say first off, this alternate sleeve that I have, clearly this is a great winter book. I mean, look at that. Anyway, so we follow this woman, this young woman who has a certain kind of magic that is, people look at a certain way. And when you're first introduced to her, she is desperate and she is trying to ally herself with a criminal. And when you get to know these characters, you actually find that there's a lot of nuance to their stories. I really liked the character development. I really liked the kind of slower way we were learning about these characters. I liked the relationship between them, how they worked together. There's some pretty devastating moments in the story. It's pretty cutthroat. It can be kind of violent at times, which is partially why I say it leans a little bit on the older end. But it's very gripping, and it's not quite as atmospheric as some of the other ones I've mentioned, but it definitely has that northeastern European feel where everything is very, very cold. I quite liked this one. I think that it doesn't get talked about as much as I think it deserves to, because I thought this first book was phenomenal. I can't wait to continue on with this trilogy. Fingers crossed that I take my own advice and I read the sequels for this winter season, because I really liked this first one and I can't wait to read on. And then with Shadow and Bone, I think that the setting itself lends itself to the winter season quite well, but also this is the perfect time if you haven't read Shadow and Bone, because the second season, it was announced that it will be coming out very soon in March. So perfect time to start this trilogy and start your Grishaverse adventure. So this is not as atmospheric, similar to what I was saying about Blood Heir. It's not as atmospheric as a lot of the other books on this list. But there are instances throughout the story where you see the characters sort of traveling throughout the land, and the setting does play a role in their survival and them trying to get by. I think some of the searches that they go on, these quests that they go on to some degree, it makes it feel like nature is playing a big role as an adversary. It's not the main antagonist, but it definitely is something that presents conflict to them. Next up, we have Dark of the West. This is one of those stories that some people would argue isn't actually fantasy because there's no magic in this book. It is a different world though, but feels like our world. So this is a military fantasy. The first book is a little strange in that you kind of get told what's going to happen at the beginning, which is something I think we used to see more often in stories where the prologue reveals things. But this one seems like it's revealing a lot. And then as you're reading, you're sad because you're like, I know things are going to go wrong. Things are going to go wrong, right? That actually happens. Why does that happen? Am I being tricked? And so there is this kind of dread as you're reading through it and this suspense. It does feel more like a historical fiction and sort of a enemies to lovers romance. You have these two characters that are from different places that you can tell these places are going to end up going against each other when eventually war breaks out. And one of our characters is a pilot, and then another character is somebody who is a part of a noble family. And so you're seeing these two characters interact with each other, trying to get information from each other, trying to earn each other's trust, and then maybe actually earning each other's trust, but they know they shouldn't, and they know they're trying to play the other. And so it has one of those settings where the enemy is within your reach, except for maybe you kind of like them. You know, I know a lot of people like that trope. Very different and a happy, fun, lovely, adventurous story that goes up against all these other tragic or epic stories. We have Warrior of the Wild. I always recommend Trisha Levenseller if you need a fun pick-me-up. This is a standalone story that follows a young girl who has to go through this trial to prove herself within her village. And something goes wrong within this trial, and as a result, that means she fails, and she has been cast out, and she now has to try and live within the wilds. And if she tries to come back to her village, there are serious repercussions because she believes, and they believe, their society believes, that you won't get to go to the afterlife if you don't fulfill this task, this impossible task you've been given that you're supposed to accomplish before coming back. So she essentially is permanently cast out of her village. She does not accept this. She decides, I'm going to accomplish this impossible task I have been given. She meets two other people that have been cast out of their villages, and she's like, we're going to work together and we're going to accomplish these tasks. And one of them is very bitter, and he's like, no, we're not. And he's very sad and down. And then the other one's just kind of bumbling, goofy, and kind of endearing, and they're adorable. The three of them together are so fun, and you can't help but root for them. You're like, you can do it. You can accomplish this impossible task. And it's so fun and delightful. I thought it was adorable. I love the relationship between the characters. And I liked there's a little bit of a mystery element to the story where you're like, this doesn't seem like there's magic. But this person seems like they have magic, so what's going on over here? And I just think it's really fun. It's really fun, and it's also not violent and tragic like a lot of the other ones on this list. And then last, we have The Goblin Emperor. This has been a recent read that I have very much enjoyed. It has an element of there being elves, goblins, kind of their typical fantasy types that you've probably seen before, but it feels so human regardless. I mean, the way that the character behaves, the way that they respond to things, the way that the trauma that they've gone through in their life is explored throughout the story, I think is very well done. It's something a lot of people can relate to. It is also a very slow-moving book. It is very political, and it is not the easiest to get into. I know fantasy gets made fun of for all of the really intense names, rightfully so, because some fantasy you're like, what's up with all these apostrophes in the middle of words? I get it. It's fair. This one is the reason that fantasy has that reputation. But that said, it is a really well fleshed out world. The author seems to know every single detail about every single family and their motivations and their behavior. And you don't. So you're getting introduced to everybody, and it's really slow moving, but it's, I thought, really gripping. I think that the main character is somebody that I very much was like, you can do it. And I don't remember, I wish I remember what it was, but when I was in high school, we watched this whole series about the Medici family. And there was one of them that came a lot later, I think, than the other ones. If anybody knows what I'm talking about, please tell me. I want to watch this again. But there was one who was just like some random person that was just living life, who had a very, very loose connection. This is relevant, I promise. They had a very loose connection to that family. But they technically were related, and something happened where then they were pulled and they were like, you're the leader now. And the person was like, what? They had no idea. They were just living life. And then they became an amazing ruler, and they took it very seriously. And everybody that was thinking this is going to be some simpleton, this will be a pawn that we can move in whatever direction we want, they didn't have any of it. They learned all these other people's names who were working for them. They earned people's trust. They, I think, learned to fight. And I'm like, that's awesome. I need that in a fantasy story, because that is such a cool story. And like, that's basically this. Maybe not to a T, but it has that sense of this character never thought they would rule. Everybody thinks that they're going to be terrible at it because they weren't really trained or prepared for this role. And then when this role is thrust upon them, they step up. And I really like stories like that. So, and also, if you know what the heck I'm talking about, we watched it in my AP World History class, and I wish I knew the name of that documentary. It was really good. Anyway, if you also know the name of that person in history, tell me that too. That's it for some winter book recommendations. Feel free, of course, to leave your own recommendations in the comment section down below. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.